specifically looking from a European perspective, how do you assess the implications for the New START's collapse for European security? Does the erosion of US-Russia arms control strengthen the case for a greater European nuclear agency, or does it heighten the risks of fragmentation and strategic instability within the region?
Yeah. Thanks so much for your question. And first of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to have me here. It's a great pleasure to talk with you about these issues, especially now at a very topical
Yeah.
time for it. So, short answer is that it can be both. And let me proceed from the main factors driving the potential instability and also creating the case for greater nuclear energy agency in Europe. So the end of New START, obviously, as many people are assessing, can herald a new strategic arms race between the United States, Russia, and China. Specifically, if the United States leadership chooses to build up its nuclear arsenal in order to deter both of its nuclear peer competitors, then Russia has the capability to rapidly upload its warheads on its intercontinental and submarine launched ballistic missiles in order to try and maintain parity with the United States. The United States Strategic Posture Commission in 2023 had this finding that Russia is prepared to potentially rapidly upload and has the capacity to do so thanks to its nuclear modernization program. And in those conditions, the absence of any restraints on Russian nuclear arsenal and the growing perception of US unreliability as far as its priorities go for alliance management and extended deterrence in Europe does strengthen the case, on the surface at least, for European nuclear agency. Another big factor, of course, is the way in which the war in Ukraine is resolved, if it is resolved anytime soon, and specifically, if Kyiv is pressed to concede crucial land without much in terms of security guarantees to show for it, and Russia is able to reconstitute its armed forces in relatively short and unfettered order, especially if the sanctions are relieved, that will heighten the perceived need on the European continent to deter Russia across all domains, including nuclear. And so now, of course, we're seeing this momentum toward some form of European independent nuclear deterrence to complement the US extended guarantees build up in the debates, as you've pointed out, over Eurobomb, or whether the United Kingdom and France could somehow augment or even fill the US role of extended deterrence guarantor. And of course, just about almost 2 weeks ago now, on March 2nd, French President Emmanuel Macron took that conversation to the next level by announcing his forward deterrence concept that would presumably begin to have greater integration with other European allies, potential forward stationing, at least temporarily, of French air-launched nuclear assets, and in general, conventional support for French nuclear operations. It is currently unclear, and I think across the board, whether this trajectory will bring sufficient reassurance to European allies and mitigate potential proliferation concerns. And so this is where certain paths toward that stronger nuclear agency could potentially exacerbate the current instability. Specifically, proliferation by new European nuclear powers or certain choices made in augmenting European nuclear deterrence could create a new security dilemma for Russia and prompt Moscow to further build up its theater range capabilities that can threaten Europe in turn. Another risk is picking potential trade-offs that would favor nuclear deterrence over conventional, and the conventional piece of it is a really important side of the equation, especially when it comes to threats from Russia to the Eastern European states, particularly the Baltic states. And so any of those choices that do trigger that additional security dilemma could trigger a negative feedback loop, which would, on one hand, strengthen European nuclear agency, but also generate instability by entering into an arms race with Russia on their own. So on the other hand, overdrawn debates over European states on how to consolidate and build out that collective security could also risk fragmenting the alliance further, especially if Russia starts deploying intermediate range capabilities in ways such that they threaten only parts of Europe. So for example, if frontline states are feeling particularly much more threatened than Western European states, there might be differences in assumptions about Russian capabilities and intentions. The final note that I will say on this, and maybe one of the ways to mitigate the chances of this negative feedback loop from emerging, is that European nuclear energy means not just a more independent nuclear weapons policy, but also a much more active role in nuclear arms control and risk reduction. So when it comes to post-New START negotiations and arrangements on the strategic level, which involve the United States insisting on involving China, that triggers Russian demand for inclusion of UK and French strategic forces in the equation. And I think this is where the UK and French policymakers really should consider coming to that strategic arms negotiations table if it means increasing the chances of imposing new limits and even maybe reductions, if we're lucky, on Russian strategic arms. And again, would love to refer to President Macron's speech here, where he said that Europe must, quote, aim for a new security framework, unquote, with Russia, and even a more important quote, involve the USA and China, including regarding nuclear capabilities, on an equitable basis, end quote. So I think this is an excellent step in the direction of greater independence in arms control policy. And of course, there are other risk reduction measures below the level of formal agreements that should be pursued as well. One of my personal, not necessarily favorites, but at least the lower hanging fruit ones that should be pursued is a pre-launch missile notification regime across the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. But of course, there are many other ways to strengthen crisis communications and build on other risk reduction approaches. And so to sum up this answer, lots of careful trade-offs are needed to avoid the negative feedback loop of instability that could trigger after the erosion of New START.
Yeah, going back to some of the other interviews I conducted, a similar theme came of, Europe acts almost as a bit of a mediator in arms control treaties. And what difference would it have if they started pursuing their own, say, European shared nuclear deterrent? How would that affect the perceptions of them as, yeah, kind of that mediator, that not neutral, but almost that in between that can facilitate those discussions, especially at a time like this when relationships are quite fragmented. And people like us are maybe looking to try and increase or improve arms treaties when major states are kind of almost not talking to each other and don't have those relationships that they even did have in the 80s and the 70s when kind of treaties started getting put into place.
Yeah, it's a difficult time to be thinking
Yeah.
about these issues, and yeah, even properly conceptualizing how arms control negotiations might come into play. I do think that as far as negotiations between nuclear weapon states are concerned, there is a danger here in the sort of cliche view of building up to building down. And I'm happy to talk about it a little bit further in the next question that you provided.
Yeah.
But I will say for now that at least between the nuclear weapon states, I don't think that necessarily decreases the credibility for being able to negotiate. And in fact, if those additional European security arrangements, steps taken by the United Kingdom and France, also come in complement with their willingness to negotiate, that could potentially work, at least as far if we take the Russian demands at face value. Of course, there's another question of the broader community, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaties Review Conference is coming up in April and May. There will be questions, of course, about Article 6 disarmament obligations by nuclear weapon states. On this, I do have to say that there are other things that are much more likely to break consensus in the incoming conference, including the war in Iran
Yeah.
that is happening now. And so there's many factors that are just attacking the NPT from all sides. But if the steps that the United Kingdom and France take to reassure the European allies actually press down the trajectory toward nuclear proliferation by other allies, that does actually give additional credibility of mitigating the spread of nuclear weapons. But again, it has to be complemented with willingness and active efforts to discuss other risk reduction measures.
Yeah, going out with that engagement. So moving on to the second question, looking at specifically your work on Russia's New Start, you emphasize Moscow's threat perceptions, assumptions, and sensitivity to ambiguity that shape escalation dynamics. This is a common thing that we see throughout. From that perspective, how do you think Russian policymakers and military planners would interpret the emergence of a European nuclear deterrent? Do you think it's kind of would it be high on their priority list, or would they see it as kind of a sidebar? Do you think it would kind of fragment those relationships even more?
Yeah, very important question. Thanks so much. Um, I would say the answer is it depends on specifically the shape of that deterrent, specific arrangements, and geographic location of new deployments, if they take place, do matter quite a lot. Right now, I would say Russian policymakers don't take the threat, such as it is, of Eurobomb or generally European deterrent too seriously. And no matter how much their state media loves to malign Europeans, Anglo-Saxons, the United Kingdom in particular, but that might change. I would here refer to excellent study that I thought took place at RAND Europe that was published in July 2025 on the evolving perceptions of Russian military analysts and experts on the UK and French nuclear deterrence. That study shows that until the most recent years, Russian experts increasingly viewed the UK as a threat from its nuclear deterrence standpoint, but a threat that was closely linked to and dependent on the United States. That came up with the Trident dependence of UK SLBM capabilities, and in general, the very close ties between the US and the UK that in the Russian, in my view, of course, myopic opinion of the United States driving all policy across Europe, especially in NATO, would further that trajectory of, well, the UK capabilities are threatening insofar as they're an extension of US will and US aggressive foreign policy toward Russia. At the same time, on the French side, they recognize the independence of the French nuclear deterrent, especially from US decision making, but used to view that as a relatively friendlier state. And it will be interesting to see how those reactions change in the wake of President Macron's speech. Very early views coming out of Moscow suggest that it's not taken super well, at least at the official level. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is criticizing it quite a lot, as you would expect. But it's interesting that, at least as of now, it is framed as, once again, an extension of NATO nuclear capabilities and viewed as an addendum to existing US deployments, thus suggesting that, well, NATO is building up its nuclear forces against us and is increasing its threats against us. So, at least at that level and in that frame, if Russia continues perceiving the United States as its key adversary, it will most likely keep viewing European developments as an extension of that threat. Now, of course, with the changes in US foreign policy and its potential reordering of priorities and changes in its attitudes towards Russia, those threat perceptions might change. And that's something that I've tried to tease out in the article on Northeast Asia perceptions, is that depending on the reorientation of US grand strategies, such as it is, Moscow might start building toward that rapprochement, in which case then any European developments might be viewed with greater suspicion. And so that's again where we need to start looking at a spectrum of different options for European deterrent and which might trigger more hostile responses. I would say new nuclear armed states, especially on Russia's periphery, like Poland, for example, or ones that carry a long and difficult history, such as Germany, would be treated with almost utmost hostility. Given the fact that they're still under the NATO umbrella, I doubt that Russia would very quickly jump to any counter-proliferation campaigns. I would remind that when Russia started its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, at least part of its rationale was couched in that counter-proliferation rhetoric. Of course, blatantly false, but nonetheless, it was part of their external calculus and external statements justifying that invasion. And as a result, that will be a part of their calculus, absolutely. And if not outright aggression to thwart any potential nuclear proliferation, Russia will almost certainly be deploying additional capabilities that strengthen seriously those countries and their capitals and their forces. Now, on the other hand, extended deterrence arrangements, if, for example, French forward deterrence concept takes off, will again depend on capabilities and specific modalities of those arrangements, but they're likely to trigger greater alarm if they're deployed further east than the current dual-capable aircraft missions and US nuclear weapons are. So this is where it's, again, worth recalling that Macron pointed out that Poland is one of the 8 countries currently in discussions with France about supporting the French air-launched nuclear capabilities. That might be one of the countries that Russia will pay special attention to in terms of how these things develop. But of course, on the other hand, any increase quantitative in UK and French nuclear arsenals that bolsters second strike capabilities primarily, ones that are really unwise to be used in first strike, such as submarine launch weapons, that will likely be taken as less of a immediate threat to respond to. And then finally, some capabilities, particularly anything dual capable that blurs the line between conventional and nuclear, especially if it's dual capable intermediate range missiles, would also be treated with utmost suspicion. Russia, of course, already deploys some of those capabilities, most notably the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile and perhaps the 9M729 missile that ended up breaking the INF treaty. And Oreshnik has recently, according to reports, been deployed as far as in Belarus. And aiming those types of missiles in Europe in greater quantities would be more destabilizing for the continent. For the time being, those deployments are still not at the level that they could potentially be. Some of those, of course, are hindered by the economic troubles that Russia is facing, the attention that it's paying to the war in Ukraine. But if it were to start deploying the intermediate range missiles in greater capabilities, Europe would certainly be under heavier pressure. And so this is where I would come back to the build up to build down phenomenon and that idea. So I think the view that if you want the Russians or your adversary in general to build down, you must first build up your own forces to pressure them to come to the table. I personally am skeptical of it for a number of reasons. One of the key ones is that it comes from a manifestation of this particular interpretation of the Euro missiles crisis in the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, and the causal link that usually is drawn when proponents of building up are talking about it between the NATO dual track decision in 1979 and its implementation and the Soviet acquiescence to negotiate the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the INF. Dual track, of course, involved pursuing simultaneous deployment of intermediate range Pershing II and Griffin missiles in Europe, and then negotiating a treaty to control those same types of weapons with the USSR in response to the threat from Soviet SS-20 missiles. Now, I am skeptical of that causal link that is drawn between we deployed the missiles, they came to the table to negotiate. One, there have already been negotiations on those systems that in fact stopped when the final vote in West Germany happened to host the Pershing II missiles. The Soviets just walked out of the INF negotiations once they saw that the final decision was made and dual track will now be fully implemented in 1983. And so it took quite a bit to get them back to the table. There were other factors at play. And so there were a lot of contingencies. And I think the most important contingency was the ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev and his reformers to the top of the Soviet Union in 1985, which specifically in the INF context led to cancellation of many of the planned hardline responses to US missile deployments in Europe. For example, before Gorbachev, the Soviets were thinking of, among other things, deploying those same missiles in the Far East to aim at the US homeland in response to Pershing and Griffin deployments. Now, if this time around, the Russian policymakers and military planners see similar types of capabilities deployed in Europe by the European states, and so they see that proverbial gun to their head aimed strictly from European policymakers, they may act accordingly and deploy their respective capabilities at Europe and thus threaten the Europe and European stability once more. And so this is why I'm not a great fan of building up to building down. And I think that might actually result in a situation in which everyone is in greater danger, particularly the European states.
Yeah, I always think of it, the idea that people think that adding more instability will somehow reach a point where then that creates a stability, and that that kind of paradox seems to run a lot of the policies and a lot of the think tanks and ideas. But when you kind of take a step back and look out of it, if it was in any other context, you'd think that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Um, just finally, I've just got one more question because I'm quite interested in the your article on cryptographic tools for verifying arms control agreements, and the idea that technology might help bridge some of the gaps that diplomacy where diplomacy is failing. Do you think at the moment that there's a realistic path for increasing those levels of verification through technology, or because of the current context and as we've talked about the relationships between these major states, has the political will just kind of, is it not there, basically?
Yeah, the question of our day. I do unfortunately think that in many ways, political will needs to come first.
Yeah.
And right now, we're seeing an absence of that. Um, I tend to come back to this one statement I heard pretty early on in my time in the nuclear field uh, that ran something along the lines of, we have the technical capabilities to achieve and verify global nuclear disarmament today if we wanted to. The question is political will. And I think the same comes back to our proposed approach with the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, my former colleague at Stanford, Neil Perry, about creating a novel kind of cryptographic data exchange that would enable some of those sensitive details on US and Russian nuclear warheads to be shared, that would actually come to achieving some of US interests of controlling the total Russian nuclear arsenal. And of course, US nuclear arsenal would be controlled similarly in parity by addressing warheads as opposed to delivery systems. So I appreciate you bringing that article up. I would say that as of now, the chances of that are quite slim, although not zero. The current US administration is, of course, interested in pursuing multilateral arms control, however that might look like. But I do think they preserve an interest in controlling Russian nuclear warheads in totality, in which case, if there are technical questions that come up during the talks, if those talks do begin, then our system could potentially become a piece of the puzzle of the overall verification regime as it would be negotiated. I do think it's challenging to think of circumstances under which that might be possible right now. But in many ways, the work that we've done under that project to devise this kind of system is relatively time agnostic.
Yeah.
Of course, the technical characteristics, especially the cryptographic techniques, are always updated in the field. And so our system similarly would need to be adjusted to whatever cutting edge new technique, especially in the zero knowledge proof realm, and post-quantum encryption and other things like that, that would need to be updated. But at the same time, that is effectively a tool that we're proposing that can be put away until a time when it is needed. You know, break glass in case of arms control negotiations type
Yeah.
of thing. And as a result, we're in many ways preparing for when the window of opportunity for the next arms control treaty will open. And it's not likely that that window is now, especially in the current geopolitical environment with as many wars and even more happening now as they are. But, you know, got to be hopeful. I think in our field, especially for arms control, risk reduction, and disarmament, optimism is almost a necessary quality to cope with the existential dread that we're all dealing with every day.
Yeah, I really like that kind of positive spin on it. Is that we're preparing, and one day, eventually, there will be a position where we can start making these changes, and then we'll have all this research, all these ideas ready to put forward, and as you say, kind of slightly update them. But generally, those ideas and those hypotheses, they're not going to change too much, and then we can come to the table with a slightly more improved way of doing things.